In this final lecture on punctuation marks, we want to look at the ellipses, parentheses, and brackets. The first mark of punctuation that I want to look at is the ellipsis. What is an ellipsis? An ellipsis is a fancy word for the three dots that are used to show a gap in a sentence or a passage. Note that the three dots or periods have spaces between them. That's important to note. It's not dot, dot, dot without spaces. It's dot, space, dot, space, dot, space. So ellipses are used when material has been omitted from direct quotation. And the material omitted may be a word, it may be a phrase, it may be a sentence, or even more. For example, Abraham Lincoln closed his first inaugural address with these words, and then we have a direct quotation. We are not enemies, but friends. Ellipsis. The mystic chords of memory, ellipsis, will yet swell the chorus of the union. Now, what's it being used for here is to create a flowing sentence that captures the essence of what the person writing wants to take from the quotation without writing out the whole quotation, because perhaps the relevance of the whole quotation, perhaps the whole quotation is not relevant, just there are certain elements from the quotation that are relevant and fit nicely into the point or argument that the writer's making. So, we are not enemies but friends. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the union. And these two uses of the ellipsis creates two sentences that flow nicely within the quotation. Another use of the ellipses is to indicate a pause of any kind or to suggest that an action is incomplete or continuing. A couple of examples. The countdown proceeded 10, 9, 8, followed by an ellipsis. We can surmise what the rest of the sequence is just from the first three words, 10, 9, 8. We know we're counting down to 0. It's not necessary, therefore, to complete the quotation. We can just finish with an ellipsis, which indicates to us that the action is continuing. Or if you insist, and then we have an ellipsis, the clerk muttered. There we are indicating that we have an incomplete thought or an incomplete action, and therefore we can assume that the clerk said more than just if you insist. One of the common mistakes I see with the use of ellipses is that people use an ellipses in writing at the beginning or the end of a sentence. That's not necessary. When we're quoting material, it's understood that the start and stop is taken from a quotation that is the middle of some passage. So we only need to use the ellipses when we are omitting something from the passage that we're quoting from. So we don't need an ellipses to indicate the start. We don't need an ellipses to indicate the end. We just need to use it to indicate an omission. And I think that maybe that confusion comes from the fact that in the example right above, we use the ellipses to indicate that an action is incomplete or continuing. But when it comes to quoting from a source, we don't need to do that. Just use the ellipses when we are omitting something from the middle of the quotation. One of the common mistakes that I've observed with the use of ellipses is the spacing. It really is important to use correct spacing and punctuation before and after the ellipsis marks. So, when an ellipsis mark appears in the middle of a sentence, we should leave a space before the first period or the first dot and we should leave a space after the last period or the last dot. For example, chords of memory, notice there's a space, then there's a dot, then there's a space, then there's a dot, then there's a space, then there's a dot, and now there's another space. That is the correct way to punctuate an ellipsis in the middle of a sentence. When in a punctuation mark occurs immediately before an ellipsis, we should include the mark if it makes the sentence easier to read. The punctuation mark is followed by a space and then the ellipsis. So, for example, we are not enemies. That quotation is followed by a comma, then there's a space, and now we have the ellipsis indicating that we are omitting some part of the quotation. So we have dot space, dot space, dot space, and then we continue the quotation, must not be enemies. When an ellipsis occurs at the end of a complete sentence, or when we delete a full sentence or more, we should place a period at the end of the sentence, followed by a space, and then the ellipsis. So, for example, we must not be enemies, period, space, dot, space, dot, space, dot, space. And now notice we continue the quotation with a capital letter indicating it's a new sentence, the mystic chords of memory. Then we have an interruption, dot space, dot space, dot space, will yet swell the chorus of the union, and then a period ending the quotation. One final exceptional use of the ellipsis is that we use a full line of space dots when we delete a full line or more of verse. So, for example, a quotation from William Blake, The Divine Image: "For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face." Then we have a line of space dots, dot space, dot space, dot space, etc., and peace, the human dress. In this case, notice too, we've got 4 or more lines of quoted material, most likely more than 4 lines because we're omitting something, and therefore we are indenting this and indicate that it is a quotation from a poem. One of the more common marks of punctuation that are often misunderstood are the parentheses. The parentheses are used in general to add extra information to a sentence, or to make a comment, or to make an aside in a sentence. Sometimes they're used to add clarity. For example, when we use an acronym and we put the definition in parentheses, or reverse, we use a definition and we put the acronym in parentheses, so we're using it as a clarification. But when we are using it as an aside or a comment or added information, note that the parentheses is less emphatic than dashes. We use a dash when we want to emphasize. We use a parentheses when we want to de-emphasize that extra bit of information. And also note that the parentheses are far more common than the use of the brackets, which we'll cover next. So the other final point is that the parentheses should not be overused, just as the dash should not be overused. So let's look at some specific examples of when we would use parentheses. We use parentheses to separate material from the main body of a sentence or a paragraph. This added material might be a word, a phrase, a list, or even a complete sentence. For example, the emergency kit contained all of the expected items: jumper cables, tire inflator, flares. The extra information just gives us more detail of what is in the actual emergency kit. Or we might use the parentheses to enclose incidental explanatory matter that's not really essential. For example, a review of commas, see Chapter 11, prior to this lesson might be a good idea. The main idea, a review of commas prior to this lesson might be a good idea, is a complete thought in itself, but in parentheses we say see Chapter 11 to give the reader an extra information on where to find a review of commas. Here we have a few more examples of specific uses of the parentheses. We would use the parentheses to enclose numerical figures used to clarify a spelled out number that precedes it. For example, this book costs $45, and then in parentheses you would put 45 and then dollars. This is often seen in contracts, for example, or rental agreements, something like that, official contracts. Another use would be to enclose numbers or letters that designate each item in a series. For example, if we were writing a list in a sentence that we wanted to number, instead of just numbering the list 1, 2, 3, we would put the numbers in parentheses. The first 3 presidents were 1, George Washington, comma, 2, John Adams, comma, and 3, Thomas Jefferson. Now, admittedly, that's a strange use of the numbers and parentheses. A perfectly fine sentence would be to leave those numbers out. But if you had some reason to put them in and you didn't want to have a numbered list, this is how you would punctuate it. You would use the parentheses surrounding each of those numbers, indicating the list. And then, of course, another use of the parentheses is when you're providing source information for an in-text citation for MLA or APA or any kind of documentation. For example, most of the model essays are only 2 to 4 pages long, and then in parentheses we have the citation, Cooley, comma, page 28, close parentheses, and then the period comes outside the parenthesis. A final common usage of the parentheses is to enclose a fully spelled out term to clarify an abbreviation or acronym that precedes it, or to use the parentheses to identify an acronym the first time it's used. For example, MIA, and then in parentheses, missing an action. In this example, we have an abbreviation, MIA, and then we use in parentheses the definition of what MIA means, or the other way around, medical college admission tests, and then in parentheses we use the acronym MCAT. Now, there are 2 different styles here. What I have to note is that in technical writing, I've always seen, and I teach, that the first time an acronym or abbreviation is used, it's fully spelled out, and then the abbreviation or acronym is put in the parentheses. Then, with each subsequent appearance, only the abbreviation or acronym is used. Your textbook follows the rule that when an acronym or abbreviation is used the first time, it's clarified in parentheses with the full spelled out term. When the parentheses enclose a whole sentence beginning with a capital letter, we should place the period or other end punctuation just before the closing parentheses. For example, answer 1 of the 3 questions, period. And then in parentheses, we have another whole sentence. Be sure to write in ink, period. So in this case, the period appears inside the parentheses. And actually, that's the only time when the end punctuation appears inside the parentheses. It's when we have a complete sentence. In this case, you might say, well, why are the parentheses around be sure to write in ink? What's indicating here is that this is an afterthought. This is something that is not essential to the understanding of the main sentence. It's extra information. So the important message is answer one of the three questions, and then the writer is giving the reader additional information by saying be sure to write in ink. So that's in parentheses, and because it's a whole sentence, it should be end with a period. But notice that the original sentence also has a period. When the parentheses do not enclose a whole sentence, then the necessary punctuation should be placed outside the closing parenthesis. For example, on the corner stood a small church, and then parentheses, a former store, and then the period ending the sentence comes outside the parenthesis. So we have here, again, in parentheses, extra information. The writer is telling us that the church used to be a store, but that's not really essential to the main point of the sentence. The main point of the sentence is saying that there is a small church on the corner. Or another example, in On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, comma, the author discusses the process of natural selection. So what this sentence is doing, the parentheses 1809, 1892 82 are telling us that that is the birthday or the birth year and death year of Charles Darwin. Again, that's extra information, and years like that are almost always put in parentheses. And then because in On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, 1809, 1882, is a prepositional phrase that begins a sentence, the introductory material has to be offset from the rest of the sentence. So we need a comma here, but the correct place to put the comma is outside the parentheses, not inside the parentheses. And we do not use punctuation before parentheses in the middle of a sentence. A necessary punctuation mark follows the closing parenthesis. The last piece of punctuation that I would like to look at is the bracket. A bracket is very rarely used in English, and it has very, very specific purposes. Brackets are not interchangeable with parentheses, but they are used for enclosures. So one example of when we would use a bracket is when we have the need for something in parentheses inside of something that's already in parentheses. It's kind of like with the quotation mark. If we have a quotation within a quotation, the outside quotation is in double quotation marks and the inside quotation is in single quotation marks. So it's the same thing with parentheses and brackets. If we have something in parentheses and we want to put something enclose something else, then we use a bracket to indicate a parentheses inside of a parentheses. So, for example, the paper included a full text of the resolution. Then we have an open parentheses expressing the sense of the House of Representatives on the calculation of the consumer price index. And then in brackets, we give more specific information, extra information. House Resolution 99, close the brackets, and then we close the entire parenthesis. So that's one valid use of a bracket. The other common use of a bracket is to acknowledge or highlight errors that occur in quoted material. For that, we use the Latin word sic, which means thus, but in interpreting it, it means the thing that just came before is an error in the original text, not an error on the part of the transcriber or the person who is quoting the material. So we would put sic in brackets immediately following the error. For example, the sign read, quote, "We do not accept," and then write sic checks. Now, what that's saying is that the original had that error, except instead of the proper verb accept. So the writer is letting everyone know that he's quoting or she's quoting material, but the original had the error accept, and we know that it should have been accept. The last use of the bracket has to do with quotations, direct quotations, where we want to insert information or we want to change information. So we would use brackets to insert comments or explanations into direct quotations. For example, quote, he, and then in brackets, George Lucas, reminded me a little of Walt Disney's version of a mad scientist, Steven Spielberg. So this is a direct quotation from Steven Spielberg, and in the quotation he used the pronoun he, but if we were reading this, we wouldn't know who he is. So while Spielberg said he, obviously in some context it was clear that he referred back to George Lucas. Just by using this quotation alone, we wouldn't know that. So we put into brackets an explanation of who he is, who Spielberg was referring to. It's George Lucas. Now, the next point, your textbook says, you may not change the words in a direct quotation, but you may add information via brackets. I would argue that the sentence above also follows the rules that we're going to go over below. In other words, I'm not changing the meaning of the sentence. I'm making the sentence fit grammatically into the context of my writing, my essay, my story, my report, whatever. So I would argue that it is okay to just substitute he with George Lucas. But again, it would still be in quotation, in brackets. So I think and again, it probably depends on the style guide you're using, but I think it would be acceptable to write quote, bracket, George Lucas, close bracket, reminded me a little of Walt Disney's version of a mad scientist. You may insert bracketed material to make the grammar of a quotation fit smoothly into your own text. Be sure, however, that you do not change the meaning of the original quotation. So, reading that sentence, I think that what I did with the George Lucas quotation fits those rules. It fits the grammar because now I don't have a faulty pronominal reference, whereas I would have before because we don't know who he is. And I didn't change the meaning of the original quotation because we know that Spielberg was talking about George Lucas. So I would argue that that was an acceptable thing. So any change you make to the original text, even if it's only from an uppercase to a lowercase letter, should be signaled with brackets. For example, in the Dinosaur Heresies, Baker rejects, quote, orthodox theory, and the letter O is in brackets because the lowercase o, because obviously the original quotation had an uppercase O, but an uppercase O would not fit into the syntax of my sentence because it is the object of it's in the middle of the sentence, it's the object of the verb rejects, it's not the beginning of the sentence, so I need a lowercase letter here, not an uppercase. I can indicate that change by putting the letter in brackets, telling the reader that I made a minor change to the original quotation. And then continuing, dinosaurs, he argues, are not just big reptiles with a, quote, metabolism that is pitifully low compared to mammals. In this sentence, I need to add the information that is to fit the syntax of my sentence. So again, like we saw up in the original sentence that we use brackets to insert explanations or comments, we can also use brackets to insert added information to improve the flow of my sentence.